家来和大家一起分享60多年以来美国以欧陆哲学为引线的历年思想运动的历史和发展。那么我们也很希望今天的这个会议吧，能够它为这个国内另类思想的这种兴起和发展来提供一些很重要的营养，以及我们未来的这个中美的两届的，然后在学院以外的领地进行更加灵活和开放的合作与交流。那么在会议的这个开始以前呢，我和三位教授有个很重要的一个共识，就是说，就是欧陆哲学在美国的一个它所谓的这样一个胜利吧。它并不应当被理解为一个很单纯的分析欧陆直接的一个二元的斗争的某一方的胜利而是应该被理解为一个多元主义的一个哲学和思想环境本身，然后在美国的一个胜利那么它也意味着不仅仅是欧洲流传过来的这些哲学，还涵盖了一切的这种国际性和世界性的哲学，比如说我们的这种东方哲学，比如说拉美哲学，比如说女性主义哲学，和你像非洲哲学以及美国黑人哲学等等一切。它就和黑人音乐、世界音乐和新音乐，然后在美国的胜利一样的原理好，那么因此我们的会议，你既可以说是围绕着美国的欧陆哲学的一个演进和发展的历史来展开的也可以说是哲学多元主义本身，然后在美国的一个发展历程的一场研讨会。接下来我们就开始有请那个三位教授。
Very much for organizing this Pathmark event on the struggle to establish pluralism and continental philosophy in the U.S. and the relation of that to the current academic situation in China. Dongku is a former student of mine at Duquesne University and is now studying in Stony Brook, where I received my doctorate in philosophy. So the world is very small, but even smaller yet, because while at Stony Brook, I had the great fortune to have Dr. Ed Casey as my mentor and dissertation director, and as a great friend for these many years after that period. I'm currently Professor Emeritus in the Philosophy Department at Duquesne University, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The road to there has had many twists and turns for me. I started my career with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana, 1962 to 1969. While there, I wrote a master's thesis on Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of mind. It was a tumultuous decade in the US at that time. The civil rights movement concerning racial justice was in full swing, and the war in Vietnam was still continuing on its terrible path. I joined an anti-war nonprofit organization called International Voluntary Service, who sent me to Laos to learn the language, live with Lao people, and work with a Lao counterpart to establish a social worker position in the Lao National Orthopedic Center. I stayed there for 5 years, 1969 to 1974. Come to think of it, I was very close to China at that time. Because I like to work with people, but also to do theory, I then entered a master's degree program in psychology at the University of Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. After practicing clinical psychology and writing a master's thesis entitled The Natural Scientific and Existential Phenomenological Approaches to Schizophrenia, I was accepted into the PhD program in psychology at Duquesne University in the fall of 1977. So here my path crosses Dr. Peg Birmingham, Peg here, because she was doing her PhD in philosophy at Duquesne at the same time that I was studying for 1 year there in a PhD program in psychology. I studied at Duquesne for a year, but decided I wanted to do my doctorate in philosophy and had the good fortune to be accepted into Stony Brook University with a scholarship. Well, in that program, I wrote a dissertation that was a phenomenological critique of cognitive psychology and received my doctorate in 1986. During that time at Stony Brook, I took a year's leave of absence, 1981 to 82, to be a visiting instructor at a university in Bogota, Colombia, teaching a course on Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception in Spanish. After that, and finishing my doctorate, I taught at the United Nations International School. It's the official school of the United Nations in New York from 1985 to 1987. Then at the University of New Hampshire for a year, followed by 3 years at Iowa State University, and finally at Duquesne University, where I became a full professor in the philosophy department and the director of the Center for Interpretive and Qualitative Research. a center which I also helped initiate. During that time, I published three single authored books, that is, books that were written by myself. The first was a critique of cognitive psychology entitled Psychology and Nihilism, a genealogical critique of the computational model of mind. That came out with State University of New York Press in 1993. The second book was a critical examination of democracy entitled The Multi-Voice Body, Society and Communication in the Age of Diversity. That came out with Columbia University Press in 2008, and then a paperback in 2011. The third book concerned public art in democracy, entitled Public Art and the Fragility of Democracy, an essay in political aesthetics, also with Columbia University Press. And I also co-edited a book entitled Chiasm, Merleau-Ponty's Notion of Flesh, and I co-edited that with Leonard Euler. And that came out with SUNY Press as well, 2000. And right now I'm writing another single authored book, Cosmopolitan Mind, The Political Ethics of World Togetherness. In all these books, I try to expand on my guiding idea of a society as what I call a multi-voice body. And every time I write in a different field, that helps me expand on that idea. And so with this next book on Cosmopolitan Mind, I hope to cultivate and develop that particular idea of a multi-voice body further. It'll also have to be, for that purpose, a cosmological voice as well. That is, I'll have to be able to use the notion of voice to talk about relationships between other entities than just human beings. And so now at Duquesne University, I've become a professor emeritus there, which includes working still on dissertation committees and teaching a graduate course when I wish, and trying to write this book I was talking about. So you can see it's been a long, circuitous road to get finally to this point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Yeah, so next we have Peg.
Thank you. And I would like to also extend my thanks for this wonderful meeting that we're having and a discussion. I fear that I have perhaps gone a bit outside the box, as it were, in this sense that I've actually woven my biography and the things that I'm doing with the presentation on my experience of continental philosophy and pluralism. So I think what I'll do here is, rather than say anything more detailed, I'll just introduce myself as Peg Birmingham, and I am in the philosophy department at DePaul University. I've been there now, it doesn't seem possible, but 30 years almost. And I am the editor of Philosophy Today. And my work is primarily in political theory and feminism. I suppose that I'm focusing on Hannah Arendt, but also questions through her of human rights, democracy, and presently very much engaged in thinking questions of an enduring world against, or as a remedy of what I'm calling the age of the superfluous. So I'll say more about myself in my presentation. And with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Thank you. Next, we have Ed.
Yes. And again, thanks to Danka for arranging this, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to listen to us. Like Peg, a certain part of my career is in my paper, so I'll just hit on some highlights. I'm currently Distinguished Professor at SUNY Stony Brook. This also has been a long path getting there. I started my graduate work in continental philosophy at a program that was at that time the most concentrated and focused program. This is way back in the early 1960s, promoting continental philosophy. This was very fortunate because not only were the courses exciting, but there were a lot of guest speakers from Europe who came through to visit this unique program. I was able to meet with them. And because of that, I decided I needed also to work in Paris. I was lucky to get a Fulbright for 2 years and spent serious time there studying with Paul Ricoeur and Michel Dufresne, and also translating 3 books in that period of my career. Returning to the US, you'll hear more about this, but it was a tough time for someone in continental philosophy to find a job because of the dominance of analytical philosophy in that period, which was really quite fierce and strong. But nevertheless, I prevailed. I was lucky. I managed to keep my head above water and to find a job finally at Stony Brook, where Fred Evans became my brilliant and remarkable student a little bit later. My writing has varied in topic. It's always been phenomenological. It's always been highly descriptive. This is true from the beginning to the present day. I started with books on imagining and remembering. And from there, from those 2 books, I went into a series of studies of place, which I felt had been neglected in Western philosophy, not only in continental philosophy, but really in Western philosophy itself. That became a ruling passion for me for, well, 20 years, really. I could really think and write about nothing but place in that period. Since then, I've diversified my writing in various ways. I had training in psychoanalysis when I was in my 30s. That led to a book called Spirit and Soul, which are really reflections on philosophical psychology and issues connected with that. But I also began to move toward other directions in the last 15 years. And I published a series of 3 books. They all have to do with what I call peri-phenomenology. That's phenomenology of the perimeter, of that which surrounds, of that which outlines, of that which is on the edge. And one of these books is called The World at a Glance, where I argue that actually we learn as much by glancing as by gazing and studied, focused looking. And the second book is about edge itself. It's called The World on Edge. And I'm delighted to say that Peg Birmingham may comment on that book at the next meeting of SPEP. I believe she signed up for this.
I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you so much for doing that, Peg. And a new book, which I just finished, to come out later this year, I hope, called Turning Emotion Inside Out, where I argue that emotion belongs as much outside us or around us as in us. And so I try to relocate emotion in this book away from the humanocentrism of the modern subject, of the heart, the mind, the brain, and try to find emotion in atmosphere, in interpersonal nexus, togetherness, and in many other contexts, try to broaden out the whole idea of emotion itself. Along the way, I've been active in various philosophical associations. You'll hear more about this, SPEP, APA. Yeah. I've been chairman of my department for 10 years, as has been Peg Birmingham. We share this and this rather dubious honor of having been in charge of our departments for a whole decade. We survived. We're still alive. We're here to talk tonight. Throughout my career, I'd say my dominant passion has been to pursue continental philosophy in fresh ways. Fresh meaning taking up topics that have been neglected and going into a very detailed analysis of them by means of description, narrative, and so on. Laying out the land, you might say, of the phenomenon in various ways in each of my forays in these various directions. So I think that's all I'll say about myself right now. You'll hear more shortly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Ed.
So today, my main question is this. How did the analytical hegemony in the United States transform into a more open and tolerant pluralism? I will address this question by recounting some events I experienced myself in the period extending from 1967 to 1980, when this hegemony of analytical philosophy was at its height in the US. This period was just when I was starting out in the profession. My first teaching job was at the University of California at Santa Barbara, a highly analytical department. I was the only continental person teaching there at the time. I was very glad to have this position, and teaching there was going well enough, except that one day, a friendly older member of the profession drew me aside and said, "Young man, I advise you to go elsewhere, as you will never survive in this department, given its fiercely analytical bent." He meant I wouldn't receive tenure, I wouldn't be able to continue. Well, I took his advice and luckily found a job, a position at Yale University, which was then a genuinely pluralistic department, although in the old style, less influenced by continental than by American philosophy and by metaphysics of the time. Nevertheless, by the time that I came up for tenure, a little later, a newly hired senior member fiercely opposed me, and I was suddenly jobless. She was hell-bent on transforming the department into one of analytical dominance, which, in fact, she succeeded in doing in the space of just a very few years. Arguing with the upper administration at this university that only analytical philosophy counted in America at that time. Of course, this was not true. There was also American philosophy itself. John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and others. And this was and still is a force to be reckoned with, at least in American thought. But it keeps getting buried and lost from attention, unfortunately. And then there was continental philosophy. This had been gaining ground in the US as translations of Husserl and Heidegger, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, began to appear in the early 1960s. Two graduate programs expressly featured these thinkers and others, the New School for Social Research in New York City and Northwestern University in Chicago. I did my doctorate at Northwestern, where I wrote a dissertation in 1967 on, the title is Poetry and Ontology in Heidegger and Bachelard. By the time I was ready to teach, I was committed to teaching and writing continental philosophy in view of its genius for speaking directly to people's concrete experience, as well as being willing to move into speculation at the ontological level. But there were very few jobs available in continental philosophy at the time, since it was regarded by analytical philosophers with disdain as something frivolous, as not serious thought. I was out of work as a result of my denial of tenure at Yale. The same was true for a number of contemporaries of mine who had likewise been forced out of teaching positions in departments dominated by analytical philosophers. We felt the full brunt of analytical hegemony, especially its fiercely ideological dimension of all or nothing. Philosophy in America had reached an impasse by the late 1960s, at the high tide of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. What was to be done? Just about then, in 1970, a small group of non-analytical philosophers, continental American philosophers, began to meet in New York City, privately, secretly. I joined them in their intense discussions as to how to open up the program of the American Philosophical Association, we call it the APA, to papers on continental and American philosophy, as well as how to elect presiding officers who were open to these countercurrents. Our little group called itself the Pluralists, and we stood for the genuine diversification of philosophy departments and official organizations. At first, we were met with indifference and sometimes outright hostility, being charged with everything from unprofessionalism to outright incompetence. Our struggle went on for almost a decade. Eventually, by 1980, the APA, which is the parent organization of all professional philosophy in the US, opened itself to our suggestions. Elections of officers came to include very diverse candidates, including people of color, women, and continental philosophers, and sometimes all three at once. None of this would have been possible had there not been another counter movement that had formed in the early 1960s. This is SPEP, the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy. The first meeting of SPEP was at Northwestern University in 1963. I attended as a mere graduate student. There were no more than 12 of us in the room. There were 6 professors and 6 graduate students. Little did any of us suspect that this organization would grow to become the second largest philosophical organization in the US after the APA itself, with a voice and a force of its own. It established itself as the main rival to analytical philosophy and directly challenged its domineering role in American philosophy at that time. This happened less by direct attacks on analytical thought than by the self-assertion of continental philosophers as having something to say, indeed a lot to say, on their own, in their own language, with their own concepts. Now, in both of the philosophical developments I have just sketched out, that is, in the transformation of the APA and the emergence of SPEP, the aim was not to create a counter-hegemony, which would have only repeated the antagonistic path chosen by analytical philosophers of that time. Instead, the aim was to create the space for a genuine philosophical pluralism at all levels. Philosophical pluralism in national meetings, local philosophy departments, and regional groups. Pluralism here signifies leaving room for differences of philosophical approach, respecting the differences themselves, and even sometimes opening up a dialogue with analytical philosophy directly, as with Derrida's extended correspondence with John Searle concerning the nature of linguistic performatives. In time, leading figures in American thought, figures who were trained as analytical philosophers, came to incorporate important elements of continental thought into their own work, notably Richard Rorty and Stanley Cavell. Now, this demonstrated the vibrancy of a pluralist approach to doing philosophical work of the highest order, whatever the exact genealogy of the concepts under discussion, wherever they came from. But this would not have happened without the developments I have here outlined, and to which I was privileged to be witness in my early career. So in my own case, after being banished by 2 philosophy departments where I first taught, I was eventually invited to join a department, SUNY, at Stony Brook, which is explicitly pluralist in orientation, even as its leading tenor is continental in character. And there I have been teaching in a setting where diverse voices emanating from what Fred Evans calls a multi-voiced body have flourished, including Fred's own forceful voice as a graduate of our graduate program, of our doctoral program, and where the eloquent written work of Peg Birmingham is widely read and admired. That's the end of my remarks, in which I am attempting to compare the fates of analytical thought with continental thought, and more generally with what I am here calling pluralism, that I very much endorse and feel is a very productive direction for philosophy anywhere and everywhere to go. So thank you for listening. And I'm going to draw to a close here, but I'm open to questions and further discussion. Donka will take the lead here.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And so next we get into Fred.
Thanks, Ed, for those remarks. In his presentation, Ed concisely states the issue that he, Peg, and I have agreed to discuss with Pathmark today. Just quoting what Ed has written here. How did the analytic philosophy hegemony in the US transform into a more open and tolerant pluralism? Question mark. End of quote. Like Ed and Peg, I wish to use anecdotes of my own career path to answer that question. I said in my biography that I started doing philosophy at Indiana University in Bloomington. And it was, when I was there, it was a pluralistic department in the beginning. This is in the 1960s. So my own response to our question about pluralism then begins with Indiana University during the 1960s, and where I earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in philosophy. Indiana University was one of the very few philosophy departments at the time who offered a very strong pluralistic program. Its faculty taught analytic, continental, American, and historical philosophy. I started out doing analytic philosophy in that department, but I soon discovered the work of Alfred North Whitehead. He was very well known as the co-author of Principia Mathematica, the leading work on formal logic, as well as a philosopher of science and quantum mechanics. But he also loved poetry and desired to create a philosophy that captures both areas of endeavor, both science and poetry. His major book, Process and Reality, saw reality better understood by the ideas of becoming and process rather than being and standard views of linear causality. To get a sense of his philosophy, and using one of his own examples, instead of saying the tree is green, it would be truer to reality to say that the tree is greening, to use the gerundative rather than a standard adjective. This view is much closer to continental philosophy and US pragmatists like William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, James Dewey, than it is to contemporary analytic philosophy. I should add that Whitehead spent his last years teaching at Harvard University. And so in my mind, I link him up with William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, and James Dewey, and these philosophers. Now, the other co-author of Principia Mathematica was Bertrand Russell, the world's leading analytic philosopher at that time. This was in the early 1900s, and also Whitehead's friend. As the story goes, the two had to introduce each other's papers at a conference. In his introduction of Whitehead, Russell said wonderful things about the English philosopher and mathematician, but ended by saying, quote, "Of course, he's very muddle-headed," unquote. After Whitehead gave his paper, he said equally exuberant things about his analytic co-author, Russell, but ended by saying, quote, "Of course, he's very simple-minded," unquote. In a nutshell, the difference between muddle-headed and simple-minded captures the difference between continental philosophy. See if I can get this. There we go. Let me start over again here. In a nutshell, the difference between muddle-headed and simple-minded captures the difference between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy, respectively, although in less than attractive terms. But it also showed how philosophers from different schools of thought could be tolerant to and even appreciative of each other and to pluralism while still maintaining their different styles of philosophy. For me, Whitehead opened up a way of philosophy that I found more attractive to me than analytic philosophy, though I learned much from analytic philosophy. From there, I went on to study Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and many other forms of continental philosophy. But Whitehead was the door that opened me to all that. But there's more to the story now. But it did not go so well for the Department of Philosophy at Indiana University. Analytic philosophy of language had become very valuable in relation to Boolean algebra logic and the new computer industry. The dean of the School of the Arts and Sciences at that time was very fond of analytic philosophy and logic and had his own plans for the kind of philosophy program he wanted to see at Indiana University. The term of office for the chair of the philosophy department, a continental philosopher, Tom Langan, had come to an end, and the dean picked an analytic candidate for the job as chair. Several advanced faculty had told the dean they would leave the university if he brought in that candidate. When he did, 6, mainly continental philosophers and historians of philosophy, left shortly thereafter, around 1969. Fortunately, they were able to find jobs elsewhere, and most of their students were able to find other PhD programs. Continental philosophy and pluralism was starting to grow despite the situation at Indiana University, which, by the way, is still predominantly analytic. Now, after that, I wanted to mention a switch. I want to go from philosophy to psychology. The Department of Psychology, I want to talk about the Department of Psychology at the University of Regina in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. After I left Laos, instead of going, I came to the US, saw my parents, and then I went to Canada to this department to study psychology. As I mentioned earlier, I found working with people was something I like very much, but I also like theory. And I thought I could have, as we say in English sometimes, my cake and eat it too by going to a psychology program. And they had a very pluralistic psychology department. So I left Laos and went to Canada. The graduate students, it was very interesting, the governance of the department. The graduate students there had parity with faculty in hiring new faculty and also in choosing the department's chair. In other words, we students could get together, decide on we thought we would like for a new hire or a new chair. And if we could just get one or two faculty vote to go along with us and stuck together, we graduate students, we would win the day. This happened once the graduate students plus the minority of the department faculty won the vote for an existential phenomenologist hire for the psychology department. But the dean colluded with the department's chair to replace the department's choice with the chair's choice. The students and faculty allies then replaced the chair, but we had lost that position. We couldn't get the existential phenomenologist, and we also lost the vote for future struggles between our student group and the faculty group. But the idea here was that existential phenomenology had gained a foothold, especially among students at this time. And they wanted it, and that was part of what powered more departments to open up to more faculty that taught continental philosophy, which allowed us to influence more students, who then demanded more continental philosophers. And this is in the area of psychology, but parallel to what was going on in philosophy. Now, from there, I went to Duquesne University. I got my MA at Regina, and instead of continuing in the PhD program there, I entered the PhD program in psychology at Duquesne University. And at that time, it was very deep into existential phenomenology, had a very strong relation with the continental philosophy department of philosophy at Duquesne. This is in 1977, 1978. And Duquesne's University Department of Philosophy was one of the first, and maybe still let's see if I'm stepping ahead of myself here. Yeah, I'm still talking about the psychology department. In a moment, I'm going to talk about the philosophy department there. But the idea was that in the US at this time, in psychology, you could not get certification for a PhD program if you were doing psychology based on continental philosophy, phenomenology, discourse analysis, or post-structuralist, post-modernist philosophy. But over the years, there had been some changes in psychology. And so by the time of, say, about 10 years ago, the psychology department at Duquesne, still a continental philosophy-based department, got the certification from the American Psychological Association, which meant it was on a parallel level with the quantitative ways of doing psychology that had been the most important and for a long time the only way to do psychology. Now, after, I think as I said earlier, then I left and did my PhD at Stony Brook, as I mentioned when I gave my biography later. So I'll skip over that. But after I got my degree, I taught at a number of different places, but then finally was accepted in the Department of Philosophy at Duquesne University. And this is post-2000, so the fortunes of continental philosophy have increased. And in our department, there's a very strong commitment to continental philosophy. The majority of faculty are continental philosophers, although we also have a very strong history component as well. The relationship between it and a more political philosophy is also very strong. Feminism, LGBTQ philosophy, and political issues are covered very, very deeply in the department. One other position I had while I was in the department was as the coordinator or director of the Center for Interpretive and Qualitative Research. In other words, we had a center that was based on doing qualitative and interpretive research as opposed to strictly quantitative methodologies in the human sciences. So that too was a powerful addition in the direction of pluralism and continental philosophy. Then I wanted to comment too on Radical Philosophy Association. Radical Philosophy Association, which was started in 1982, continues on to the present. The people in the association are both analytic and continental philosophers, but they come together in the name of progressive political thought. And I thought this might be interesting from the point of view of Pathmark, that if we take Marxism as a philosophy, there are many different forms of it. And some of those forms are very much in line with continental philosophy. There's one particular scholar, Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's a Marxist, but with a somewhat of a post-structuralist, postmodernist tilt. And his work has been translated into Chinese. So I keep wondering if there's an overlap here of what's happening to China, where some of the traditional ways are taken up in a non-traditional fashion, and that opens the door a bit more. So that's actually a question I have to our Pathmark hosts. So the Radical Philosophy Association describes itself as against capitalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, disability discrimination, environmental ruin, and all other forms of domination or authoritarianism. Members are of many different nations and continue a variety of radical traditions, including, but not limited to, feminism, phenomenology, Marxism, anarchism, post-structuralism, post-colonial theory, and environmentalism. And efforts, I'm sort of quoting here from the mission statement, efforts center on conferences and publications and consider the enterprise of radical philosophy inherently interdisciplinary and welcome persons not trained in philosophy. So people from other fields are welcome in it as too. We had, back a number of years ago, we had a wonderful exchange program with radical philosophers in Mexico. So we had some of our conferences in Mexico and others in the US, but where we had papers given in both language, English and Spanish, and trying to figure out how to get through the differences of language to make that work for us rather than against us. Then there's the Society for Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy, SPEP, which I think Ed's already said something to that. I think Peg will be saying more on it. So I'll just mention that I served on its executive committee, but both Peg and Ed were the co-directors of SPEP at different times and know it in that sense far better than I. Finally, I think actually there I don't know how much my how much time I have left, but I could go in to say a little bit about, you had asked me to say something about public art, but if we're going to do that later, should I just save it for then?
I think you can talk about it right now.
Okay, I'll do that, but I do want to say, before I do that, I want to say that the person we really want to hear about that is Ed. He has a whole master's program in the philosophy of art. He once invited me to give a paper there, which I have very cherished memories about as well. And I think Peg's done a lot of work in this area too. But then just for my own part, I published this book recently, Public Art and the Fragility of Democracy, an essay in political aesthetics. It was with Columbia University Press in 2019, so just this past year. I'll read you the description, which I believe you have it in Chinese, Mandarin. So I'll just read it as I have it here, and that'll make it a little bit easier for me.
Yeah.
Democracy inherently questions its own identity. It therefore allows public art to explore its values critically and to suggest new ones. But this openness to revision also facilitates artworks that can serendipitously or fortuitously undermine democratic values and sponsor authoritarian voices instead. To help further the first, that is, the values that are critically public art as exploring its values critically and suggesting new ones, and to forestall the second, that is, artworks that can surreptitiously or fortuitously undermine democratic values. To help further the first and forestall the second of these two alternative outcomes, I develop a criterion for assessing what sorts of public art qualify as acts of citizenship, of actions of citizenship in a democracy. This endeavor requires characterizing democracy, acts of citizenship, and public art at the same time as we clarify the criterion, building our ship as we navigate on it. Moreover, the criterion at which I arrive must be as flexible as democracy itself. It must therefore be what contemporary philosophers call an event in opposition to a static or closed concept. So when I'm developing this criterion, I arrive at one that has both a political dimension and an aesthetic dimension. The political dimension is that the kind of art that seems to be in sync with democracy would be one that would have an innovative relation to democracy, that would bring out creative nuances of democracies, new ways of thinking about democracy, but would also have resistance to what I call oracles, or art that is oracular, ones that bolster authoritarianism or racism or sexism and all the rest. And then the aesthetic, that's the political dimension of this criterion. The aesthetic dimension is that the aesthetic dimension of artwork must sustain or reinforce its political dimension. That is, it must resist the oracle of spectacle, of something that would just put the emphasis on the aesthetic, that would blind us, so to speak, from hearing the political side of it. And that would act as kind of a quasi voice that would interrupt the predetermined or stereotypical ways others might encounter the artwork, and that would open up to novelty. So that then completes what I wanted to say in sync with what Ed and Hagar are saying. Thank you.
But thank you, Fred. And let's move on to Peg. It's your turn.
Again, I just want to say thank you for this wonderful invitation and discussion that we're having on continental and analytic philosophy and the encounter, we could say. I thought that I would approach this question a little bit differently, given how I am placed, as it were, in this encounter. And it has to do with my own history in philosophy, first as an undergraduate, and then a graduate student, and then in my academic appointments, particularly at DePaul University. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about that, because my experience in this struggle for pluralism has been, perhaps I would say almost completely, if I'm honest about it, has been involved with the struggle for pluralism within continental philosophy. And I thought I might speak a little bit to that and how that has, in my view, impacted the struggle for pluralism that Ed and Fred talk about in terms of the encounter of continental philosophy with analytic philosophy. And so I thought I would just say a bit about that and how the struggle for pluralism within actually impacted significantly on a broader notion, broader pluralism in the profession in general. So let me start by just saying that I earned my undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, much to my parents' dismay, who wanted me at Madison, the flagship university, Division I. But a few years earlier, in Green Bay, a new university had been started called EcoU. It was devoted to the environment in all of its senses. And I wanted to be part of that experiment. When I was there, I met two professors, one particularly influential, Fred Kersten, who is was the first translator of Husserl's Ideas I into English, and Gilbert Null, who wrote a dissertation on Husserl with Aaron Gurvich at the New School, although he finished with Mohanty because Gurvich died midway through his writing of that dissertation. So both Gurvich and Kersten studied with what we might call the continental luminaries: Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, Dorian Cairns, Gurvich, of course. And I mention this because in many ways, I was, as an undergraduate, the fourth generation of this philosophical continental lineage that went back to Husserl, Heidegger, and Jaspers specifically. So I knew quite a bit about the continental lineage. I was very much living it. But I knew nothing about the analytic continental divide because it never came into the hallways, as it were. So early on in my studies, Kersten invited me to his graduate seminar on Husserl's logical investigations. And from there, I took many of his seminars on Shaler, Merleau-Ponty, and what would be his book, The Phenomenological Method. He lectured extensively on that. I think if I think of my undergraduate studies, I think of how many of the phenomenological reductions I did while eating lunch, sitting by the lake. Kersten, and there was a real affinity. Kersten was of a descriptive phenomenology. He would say, go do a phenomenological reduction of the sailboat sailing on the lake. And so I would, and I loved it. But he also stressed literature. We studied literature. He taught classes in tragedy and comedy with an English professor. And with Gilbert Null, he was very interested in questions of non-Euclidean geometry and mathematics. Again, I think that speaks, Ed, to your point about that classical phenomenology, rooted in Husserl, Husserl's first book being, of course, Philosophy of Arithmetic. So we all traipsed over to non-Euclidean geometry with Professor Null and spent a semester there. So what strikes me about my undergraduate education was the absence of firm disciplinary boundaries or divides. The message I got from both Kersten and Gilbert Null faculty was that we needed to know as much in math, science, and literature as philosophy if we were to become good philosophers. So I then went on to Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. I arrived after the infamous split within continental philosophy there, where some went to Penn State, others went to DePaul. And again, I studied with philosophers who had been educated, one of particular Lester Embry at the New School, again a Husserlian. And another person I studied with extensively was Professor Wilhelm Wurzer, who was Eugen Fink's last research assistant in Freiburg. So what I want to emphasize is that both as an undergraduate and a graduate student is that I was educated in classical phenomenology with professors who rightly claimed a direct lineage to the fathers, so to speak. Here in Chicago, I have a lot of friends in architecture, and they refer to those faculty, now most of whom have passed away, who worked directly with Mies van der Rohe, and they used to call these faculty those who touch the hem of the garment. So I was sort of in that lineage of those who had touched the hem. But in Pittsburgh, it became clear to me there was another tradition, because just up the street from Duquesne University was the University of Pittsburgh, which at that time, and I think continues to be, ranked at the top or close by in analytic philosophy. But we were encouraged to take classes at the University of Pittsburgh. So there was both a sense of division, but also a reaching out to a very, very limited extent. I stress, though, that in my studies, there were no classes on any women philosophers. So for instance, I never took a class on Hannah Arendt. Towards the end of my studies, a professor at Duquesne, my graduate studies, taught a class on Simone de Beauvoir, but it stood out as being really the only class in what we could call a feminist thinker. So I read Hannah Arendt on my own, mostly as a graduate student. I don't remember reading Arendt as an undergraduate, but I started to read Hannah Arendt as a graduate student, but only on my own. And when Fred Kirsten read my dissertation, which was on Heidegger and the question of free will or agency, he said to me, "This is a very Arendtian Heidegger." And I had to agree. But I never gave papers or anything on Hannah Arendt. I was sort of a quiet, a silent figure in my own work. So after a few years of teaching at an upstate college in New York, and then 2 years at Pace University in New York City, both of these places were very pluralistic, devoted to undergraduate teaching. I took a position at DePaul University in 1992, and in the philosophy department there, had just hired in 1989 David Krell from Essex University in England to revive a dormant continental philosophy program, very sleepy, and he was given authority to fill positions, 4 positions, and given complete autonomy in the direction of what came to be called the new philosophy department at DePaul. In 1990, one of his hires was Michael Nass, a student of Ed's, who specializes in both Plato and Derrida. I would say there we have pluralism at its best. And in 1992, he hired me along with Will McNeill, who is today probably the most eminent translator of Heidegger, who has eclipsed David Krell. And this was said by David Krell himself. So I'm not speaking critically of David. And Will was a student of David's in Essex. After many discussions and debates, the department decided to focus exclusively on providing doctoral training in continental philosophy from a pluralist perspective that included a deep training in the history of philosophy. I was hired because of my work on Hannah Arendt, as well as in feminist philosophy. And through Arendt and feminist philosophy, I became increasingly interested in questions of human rights, political sovereignty, and questions of power and violence, which were certainly animating my dissertation on Heidegger and this question of agency and freedom. So I would say that during my time at DePaul, the program, particularly the doctoral training, added seminars and what we could call the mothers as well as the fathers. There were many more courses, and that led to others. So there were many courses in feminist philosophy. And when I became the philosophy's chair, as Ed had pointed out, which was from 1995 to 2005, DePaul decided to double its enrollment from a sleepy little university to being the largest Catholic university in the United States. And that was an opening for philosophy. We got many, many positions, including Tina Chanter, another student from Stony Brook who added to our feminist philosophy offerings. We also added seminars in critical race theory, faculty who could teach Latin American philosophy. We hired Frank Perkins, who specialized in Asian philosophy, who had a doctorate from Vanderbilt. And that became our connection with Shanghai, with Fudan University. And we went back and forth for several years until Frank was unfortunately lured away to the University of Hawaii, which has a robust Eastern and Asian philosophy program. This did not come without a lot of struggle and debate in the philosophy department. There were many faculty who thought that courses in feminism, critical race theory, were simply not doing real philosophy and fought these hires, wanted further hires in Kant and Hegel and in Ancient. But we persevered, and I'm happy to say that last year we hired a young scholar in decolonial theory, and I was struck by the unanimity of the philosophy department. Rather than a lot of debate, this isn't real philosophy, there was nothing but enthusiasm and exuberance for this new area for us that had been lobbied for a long time by our graduate students. And I think the students who are listening can learn from this. It was their lobbying that also helped pluralize our department. Now, I just wanted then to say that, again, in my experience, and Ed has talked to this, that the department's shift in its increasing embrace of pluralism within the continental tradition was mirrored by the continental philosophy in the profession itself, particularly SPEP. So in 1986, I attended my first SPEP conference in Toronto. And there, at the SPEP business meeting, a coup led by Iris Marion Young and Nancy Fraser, and loudly supported by Ed Casey, I still remember him in a chair to the left of me, they demanded sweeping change at SPEP. And it was a kind of fracas that broke out, but they prevailed and they won. And they won, the two demands were significant. One was co-directors that would reflect gender parity, an elected executive committee that would reflect a wide range of research interest within its membership. So I would say that it's no exaggeration to call this the 1986 SPEP revolution, in which much greater pluralism became part of the SPEP conference every year. And I'm just going to say briefly that Ed in 2007 again from the floor of the business meeting, challenged the two nominations that had been put forward by the executive committee for traditional, both were traditional Husserlian scholars, very good. But Ed demanded that we open this up a little bit and nominated a younger phenomenologist, Len Lauber, who was not only a Husserlian, has a very good book out on Husserl, but tilling the fields of Derrida, Deleuze, and Badiou, to name just a few. Len won that election entirely due to Ed's efforts on the floor, and has radically opened up the area of phenomenology at SPEP, including now, I think, an emerging area of critical phenomenology. So my time in the executive committee and as co-director, which would not have been made possible without Iris, Nancy, and Ed, carried out the work of the 1986 revolution, such that I think today, if you look at the SPEP program, you will see a pluralistic program with quite a bit of presentations on feminism, critical race theory, queer theory, and decolonial theory, just to name some of the areas, disability studies that one finds on the annual SPEP program. So I was going to say a little bit about my work in philosophy today, but let me just quickly, because we're running out of time, or I'm running out of time, to say here too, I have been making a large effort to expand the journal's focus, and certainly have done that specifically through inviting guest editors to edit special issues on topics such as new materialism. Our forthcoming issue, which is guest edited by Yuk Hui on automaton and AI. We have an issue coming up on the intersection of continental philosophy and Black studies, another on affect theory, and still another on Black philosophy today. So again, I think that my experience has been, and hopefully have helped further those efforts for pluralism within the continental tradition. And I think, and let me just be my conclusion then, that the struggle for pluralism within continental philosophy has contributed to the struggle for pluralism in continental philosophy's encounter with analytic philosophy. Many of the theoretical fields that I mentioned in my remarks, feminism, critical race theory, decolonial theory, Latin American philosophy, have emerged alongside and in conjunction with thinkers who work at the intersection of both traditions. It would be very hard, it seems to me, to prize apart who's an analytic feminist thinker and who is a continental thinker. One can, but that's not the point. And there's so much cross-fertilization that the question becomes, it's not so fruitful to think about feminist philosophies and the differences in feminist philosophy from that divide of the continental and analytic. It's more about methodologies in a much larger sense, new epistemologies. Some of the work that Ed mentioned on the animal have come out of feminist philosophy, both, as Ed mentioned, Donna Haraway and Kelly Oliver. So Haraway and Oliver come out of very different traditions, but really working in the same philosophical field. So my point being is, where it's very difficult in these emerging theoretical fields to separate out or to think about them in terms of the continental analytic divide. And I just want to add one more thing at the risk of taking too much time, that it was Sheila Ben Habib, and again, it's the work on Hannah Arendt who defies also that distinction between continental and analytic divide. There are thinkers working in both traditions that come together to discuss her work. But it was Sheila Ben Habib, president of the APA at that time, and I, who was on the APA nominating committee. I don't know how that happened, but there I was, much to the dismay of my 4 or 5 members, my cohort, who were all analytic, and voted en bloc for someone other than the person I nominated, which was Ed Casey. Well, Sheila stepped in, and together we prevailed. And Ed was nominated and elected. He was actually all this was to get him on the ballot, not to do any more, but to make him one of, I think, 3 names. Well, having prevailed to get Ed on the nominating committee, on the nominating ballot, he was elected, which meant as vice president, which meant that the next year he became the president of the American Philosophical Association, the APA, this association, Ed, that had when you were as a graduate student and then at Santa Barbara, would have nothing to do with you. I think it's tremendously wonderful, good news, that something delicious about the fact that you became the president of the APA. And I want to say that what led Sheila and I together to do this was not just a shared conversation we had been having for years on Hannah Arendt, but that we both agreed that what was so desperately needed was someone who was not necessarily aligned with analytic. Well, certainly Ed was aligned with continental philosophy, but for Sheila and myself, what was so desperately needed and what Ed Casey brought to the APA was a long-standing commitment to philosophical pluralism. And I thought it was significant that it took Sheila, analytic, and me, definitely in the continental tradition, to do this. Although certainly it was Ed himself who did all the work in getting there. So to conclude, in my view, the analytic continental quarrel is an old and worn out quarrel, and one that no longer is up to the task of thinking today. That it seems to me that the real victory, and Ed and Fred have both spoken to this, is the ongoing success, although it is still a struggle, for a pluralistic, multi-voiced philosophical space, which recognizes that we will disagree, and I think Fred spoke to this, often passionately, about proper methodologies, epistemologies, what counts for experience, this notion of Erfahrung, which we get so deeply, really orients Husserl's philosophy and phenomenology more generally. What counts for experience, and how do we philosophically address it? These are some of the questions that we will have arguments and debates about. But it seems to me that we do not need to have an old quarrel about continental, who has won, which is just a Pyrrhic victory anyway, but a quarrel that reflects institutional power, like an old married couple who's going to argue about who is wearing the pants. It's simply not fruitful for the kinds of issues, urgent issues, that philosophy must take up and think in the present age. And let me then say in conclusion that it seems to me that it will always be the students who are the cutting edge of this pluralistic space pushing the elders for more openness, for more radical questioning, for new concepts not yet thought that will more adequately allow for thinking our present age. So don't give up, keep going in this struggle for philosophical pluralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very inspirational. And
actually, let me intervene briefly here to thank Peg for a really moving, eloquent talk and making a very profound point that we really need to take very seriously. And I have to intervene here because unfortunately I'm due at another event, which is my own birthday party, and so I'm going
I'll
to
explain that too. Yeah. Don't worry.
I'm going to have to bid adieu to this meeting, but I've really enjoyed being part of it, and I thank Donka and the rest of you for including me. And I hope we can meet again and talk again together.
Okay. Thank you.
So I will have to vanish. Okay.
It's very nice to have you in our meeting.
Well, okay. All right. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, Ed.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Right.